They all laughed when she called me a fat pig at the wedding. Even my own son looked away. I didn't say a word. Not when she mocked my dress. Not when she whispered, loud enough for the table to hear. He must have invited her out of pity. But when her father saw my face, he dropped his champagne glass. And suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to him, not to anyone. My name is Lillian, and if they think humiliation is the end of a story, they've never met a woman who built an empire in silence. The day of Matthew's wedding had the kind of glitter that made strangers stop in the street just to stare. Crystal chandeliers glowed over walls draped in silk. A string orchestra filled the cavernous ballroom with soft crescendos, while waiters moved like shadows carrying trays of vintage Bordeaux. Every detail was curated to announce wealth and lineage. I kept to the edge of it all, perched at a round table far from the stage, my palms resting on the cool linen. The dress I'd chosen was plain gray with a rounded neckline, and around my wrist lay the thin silver bracelet my mother once wore. It felt like the only solid thing in the room, a quiet anchor against the tide of excess. Clarissa floated through the crowd like she owned the air itself, her arm entwined with Matthew's. She wore a fitted white gown that glittered with hundreds of tiny crystals, a halo of cameras and whispers following her. She reached our table without breaking her smile. "Matthew," she cooed, her voice sweet enough to stick to the back of your throat. "You haven't introduced me to your mother yet. This is Lillian, my mother-in-law." I suppose no one noticed her because she paused just long enough to tilt her head and flash a perfect grin. She's so modest, she almost disappears. The words were soft, but they hit like a slap. A ripple of laughter rose from the nearby tables. Glasses clinked. Someone murmured something I couldn't catch. I felt every eye flick over me, some pitying, some amused, as if I'd been cast in a role I hadn't auditioned for. I tightened my hands in my lap until my knuckles whitened. My smile stayed fixed. Years of discipline held it there, but I could feel heat rising behind my eyes, a low burn that tasted like iron. Clarissa leaned closer to Matthew and whispered something only he could hear. He gave a small, nervous laugh and looked away. That, more than the words, cut deepest. Then, out of the noise, a different sound, glass against marble, a gasp like air sucked from a room. Howard, Clarissa's father, had stopped mid-handshake, his brow furrowed. He stared at me across the dance floor as if he'd seen a ghost. "Forsyth?" he muttered, voice cracking just enough to draw the attention of the men beside him. "It can't be. You?" The chatter around us dulled, a hush sliding over the gilded room. His eyes locked on mine, full of recognition and something sharper, fear, maybe, or shame. I didn't move. My breath slowed until it was a measured, silent thing, because I knew exactly what that look meant. The past I had buried for 2 decades was clawing its way back to the surface, and for the first time all evening, the laughter at our table stopped. I drove home in the rain, headlights cutting across slick pavement as if they could carve a path out of that ballroom and back into silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't flip on the kitchen lights. I just sat there, coat still on. My hands curled around a cup of untouched tea, watching the window fog over with the breath of a house too quiet to feel like home. The flash in Howard's eyes haunted me. That flicker of recognition, that whisper of disbelief, he hadn't been wrong. He remembered me. Not as a mother-in-law, not as some quiet woman in gray, but as the woman who sat across from him at the negotiating table 17 years ago, when I signed away the last of his family's hotel chain under the name of a faceless investment group. I remembered the conference room in Manhattan, the heat of the fluorescent lights overhead, the way Robert's pen moved without hesitation. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't gloat. We just acquired what was there to be taken. Howard never saw it coming. Robert and I had built our portfolio brick by brick, focusing on failed ventures that still had a heartbeat if someone cared enough to resuscitate them. We weren't predators. We were patient opportunists. And when Robert died of a sudden stroke 12 years ago, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the seat he left behind. I chose invisibility not because I was afraid, but because it made sense. Matthew was in grad school. He deserved to earn his own life, not inherit mine. I let him believe I lived modestly, on a pension, on memories, on the kind of quiet life widows are expected to settle into. He never questioned it. He never had reason to. But Clarissa had eyes sharper than her manicure. At the wedding, I watched her track me with the precision of a hawk watching a mouse that refuses to scurry. Her gaze lingered on the scuff marks of my shoes, on the bag I'd carried for 5 years too long. I knew that look. It was the look of someone assessing value, calculating risk, estimating return. That night, after I'd changed into flannel and tied my hair back, I received a call from Carter, my financial advisor for the past 15 years. "Lillian," he said, tone lower than usual. "I think we have a problem." He explained that a legal team out of New York, one with a known specialty in estate exposure and family asset tracing, had filed an inquiry into property portfolios tied to an entity I controlled. Quietly, yes, but not invisibly. They're trying to connect someone called L. Forsyth to the Wellington acquisition, he added. They're digging with purpose. I stared at the lake through my kitchen window. It was black glass at night, reflecting only the kitchen's silence. I lifted my glass of wine, swirled it once, and held it at my lips without sipping. The storm was no longer theoretical. It was coming. And Clarissa Howard? She wasn't just sniffing around out of curiosity. She was building a case. And I knew now, with every instinct sharpened by years in the shadows, the question was no longer if she'd come for me. It was only when, 3 days later. The invitation arrived via text. No emojis, no false sweetness, just a time and a place, 12 p.m., the Carlton, Clarissa. When I walked in, she was already seated. White blazer, perfect waves, burgundy lips. A bottle of Tignanello 2015 was already breathing between 2 glasses. She smiled as I approached. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for the server to pour. "I thought we could talk. Woman to woman." I sat. Let her talk. "I think there were some tensions at the wedding, and I'd like to clear the air. We're family now, right?" she said, eyes glinting. "I believe in clarity when it comes to money, and family legacy." I took a sip of wine, said nothing. She leaned forward, her voice softening. "Matthew is an only child, and I know you've done everything on your own. But I think it's time we start planning long-term together." She slipped a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "I've put together a proposal. Something simple to start, the Forsyth Foundation. $70 million in assets, managed equally between the 3 of us. For future generations, for transparency, for control." I didn't touch the folder. I didn't blink. And then came the twist. Her phone lit up beside the bread plate. A notification flashed at the top of the screen, just long enough for me to catch it. Aguilar Investigations, email confirmed. Lillian Forsyth linked to Global Equity Fund. Yeasty? 2011. She didn't notice me looking. Or maybe she did. She just smiled and kept speaking. Voice honeyed. "It's just a starting point. Of course. But I know how to structure trusts for families like ours." My heart didn't race. My fingers didn't twitch. I just tilted my wine glass, watched the legs run down the side, and let her talk. Because now, I had confirmation. She wasn't just playing polite. She was playing chess. And she thought I was the pawn. But I'd been playing endgames longer than she'd been out of grad school, and she had no idea how badly she'd miscalculated her opponent. I said nothing to Matthew after the lunch with Clarissa. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I knew anything I said in that moment would either sound like paranoia or guilt. And I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of watching me scramble. Still, silence has its own consequences. He came by a few days later, not the same son who used to drop by with coffee and tell me about traffic or construction sites. This Matthew was stiff, guarded. He sat at the kitchen table across from me, his fingers laced tightly together. He didn't smile. "Mom," he said slowly, "did you ever invest in Wellington hotels?" I looked at him, at his face, so much of his father's jaw but his own furrowed brow. The question hung there, too casual to be innocent. I wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to grab his hands and say yes, and explain everything from the beginning. But sometimes, the people you love most are the ones you lie to, not to hurt them, but to hold them together. So instead, I asked, "Why are you asking me that?" He didn't answer right away. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and placed it face up on the table. A blurry photo filled the screen, a clipping from a 2011 article. It showed a contract signing. The press had zoomed in on the executives shaking hands. But off to the left, almost out of frame, stood a woman in a gray dress, holding a leather bag. I knew that bag. I still had it. "Clarissa said her father remembered seeing you in a major deal years ago," he said. "She said you're not who I've always thought you were." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just reached for my tea and took a long, slow sip. It had gone cold. It wasn't fear that gripped me. It was recognition. The slow, dull ache of watching the trust between mother and child begin to bend under the weight of suggestion. Clarissa hadn't just found a thread. She'd started weaving a narrative. I didn't speak again until he left. I waited until I heard the door click shut, then walked to the window and looked out at the lake. The water was flat, unmoving, but below the surface, I knew it was stirring. And so was everything Clarissa was planning. The next morning, Carter called. His tone was clipped. "Lillian," he said, "you've got a problem. Someone's trying to trace the ownership of your holding companies, not through financial audits, through legal maneuvering. They're using a family law firm, estate litigation and divorce strategy. They're not digging for dirt. They're building a trap." I didn't need a name. I already had one. Clarissa wasn't just curious anymore. She was laying foundations. "Let me guess," I said. "She's not coming through investment channels. She's coming through domestic ones. Marriage, inheritance, intent." "Exactly." So I made a decision. If she was going to treat this like a chessboard, then I would too. I hired someone to quietly look into Clarissa. Not because I was afraid, because I believe in knowing my opponent. The results arrived faster than I expected. She'd opened 3 high-limit credit cards in the past 3 months, over $80,000 in revolving debt. The charges were spread between private investigators, a boutique law firm in Manhattan, and high-end retailers I knew from my days in mergers, places that offered the illusion of wealth for people trying to stay in the game. But it wasn't just the numbers that struck me. It was the recording, a phone call, clarity perfect enough to make my blood chill. Clarissa was speaking to someone, a woman whose voice I didn't recognize. She said, "This time, I've got it right. He's soft, but he's stable. The key isn't him, it's his mother. If I can get control of her, the rest falls into place. It wasn't rage that hit me. It was something colder, sharper. Resolve. That night, I printed every document, transcript, and credit report. I sealed them in a folder, slipped it into my safe, and walked away. I wouldn't use it yet, but I would, because she'd pushed the first domino. And now, everything was beginning to fall. That weekend, Matthew came by again. He looked pale, jaw tight. She said, "You refuse to share any financial planning with her," he said. "She thinks it's because you don't trust her." I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, at the boy I raised, at the man who now looked like he didn't know whose side he was supposed to be on. So I asked him one thing. "Do you trust me, Matthew?" He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just looked away. And in that silence, I knew. This wasn't a conflict between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law anymore. This was a war over my son's belief in me. And Clarissa wasn't just after my money. She wanted to cut me out by making me the villain. But I had learned long ago, when someone comes for your name, you don't run. You sharpen it like a knife. The message came just after 9 p.m. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a line of text that read like a summons. Lunch. Tomorrow. The Carlton. 12 p.m. Just you and me. I stared at it for a few seconds, then placed my phone screen down and poured myself a glass of water. The kind of meeting that didn't come with emojis usually came with a plan. I arrived exactly on time. Clarissa was already seated, of course, her blazer the color of bone, tailored within an inch of its life. A thick binder rested beside her wine glass, the edges worn from use, not design. She didn't stand to greet me. She simply looked up with a tight-lipped smile and gestured to the chair across from her. No wine this time. No smiles. "I think we need clarity," she said, flipping open the binder. "I have every reason to believe you've accumulated substantial assets through layered shell companies and offshore holdings, and you've made no effort to create a financial roadmap for Matthew or for us." I didn't flinch. I folded my hands in my lap and let her continue, the way a teacher lets a child recite multiplication tables. Her voice was steady, but her eyes sparkled with the thrill of control. She turned the binder around so I could see. Inside was a printed report, stamped by an independent financial research firm. Page 1 was a photo, grainy but clear enough. Me, in 2017, signing papers at a boardroom table. The name above the headline, "Global Equity Fund Finalizes Coastal Property Acquisition." The fund had been owned, quietly, by one of my shell corporations. "You've built something massive," she said, sitting back and sipping her wine. "And honestly, I admire it. But transparency is overdue. I think it's time we start planning, like a family." She let the word hang in the air like a threat wrapped in lace. "If you won't cooperate willingly, well, the legal system has its ways." I didn't blink. I reached into my handbag, removed a slim envelope, and placed it gently on the table. Clarissa raised an eyebrow but didn't touch it. "You'll want to read that," I said, folding my napkin onto the table. Inside was a full financial breakdown of the Howard Group's current solvency status, or rather its lack thereof, quarterly income reports, operating losses, and a tidy little ledger showing direct quarterly transfers from one of my companies to a consulting firm, which funneled those funds to none other than Howard himself. Clarissa stared at the first page, then the second. I let her flip through the third. "Your father has been living off strategic advisory fees from properties I own," I said quietly, "which means your family's lifestyle is a courtesy I've chosen to extend." Her jaw twitched. "If I wanted to end that courtesy," I added, my voice steady, This carpet under your shoes wouldn't belong to your name by next quarter." She stared at me, frozen. The smile she'd worn like armor cracked for the first time. I stood, slid my chair back into place. "You want a war, Clarissa? Careful which direction you swing first, because some people aren't playing defense." 3 days later, a subpoena arrived at my door. Clarissa had filed for an emergency family court hearing. The charges were broad but calculated: concealment of marital assets, pre-financial fraud, and emotional distress tied to perceived inheritance misdirection. In other words, she was throwing every accusation she could and daring me to let even one stick. I wasn't surprised, but Matthew was. He showed up at my house the night before the hearing, rain-soaked, eyes red like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was a mess, his voice even worse. "She said you're trying to ruin our marriage," he said, "that you've been controlling everything, money, decisions, even me, that you don't want me to be happy." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I walked to the hallway safe, unlocked it, and pulled out a thick binder of my own. I placed it in front of him and sat across from him without a word. "Read, Matthew," I said, "then decide who's been doing the controlling." He hesitated, then opened it. Page 1. Copies of 3 credit card applications, opened in Clarissa's name just months earlier, with high-limit approvals. Page 2. Detailed transaction reports showing payments to private investigators, legal consultants, and a boutique PR firm. Page 3. A transcript of a recorded phone call. Clarissa referring to Matthew as a stable option, a long-term safety net. Page 4. A draft legal document prepared before the wedding, a petition for legal separation citing unclear financial status. Matthew didn't speak, but I watched the exact moment the truth settled into his bones. His shoulders dropped, his breath slowed. The next morning, we sat on opposite sides of the table at the Carlton Conference Suite, my lawyer beside me, Clarissa with hers. Her parents present but silent. She began, "I'm willing to drop the complaint," she said, cool as steel, "if we establish the Forsyth Legacy Trust, starting capital, $15 million, 3 equal trustees, myself, Matthew, and Lillian. This allows us all a voice in future financial matters." I stood and walked to the window, staring out over the towers of downtown. They looked so stable from here, but I knew better. When I turned back, I spoke clearly, calmly. "I have a counter-proposal, one time only, no discussion, no negotiation." And with that, the room shifted. Clarissa wanted a game, but I had already written the ending. The room was silent but heavy, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Legal pads lay open, pens aligned, contracts stacked between us like cold weapons. My voice cut clean through the tension, as even and deliberate as a scalpel. "I'm offering $10 million one time, transferred within 48 hours. In exchange, you'll sign a comprehensive agreement withdrawing all claims, dismissing all complaints, and severing all contact with me and Matthew, permanently." Clarissa let out a short, sharp laugh, more of a scoff. "Really?" Her lips curled. "You want to buy me off?" I didn't blink. I slid a file across the table, the quiet scrape of paper on oak sounding louder than it should have. "I'm not buying you. I'm assigning value to your silence." That landed like a slap. Clarissa stared at the folder but didn't open it. Her lawyer's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Howard sat stiffly at the end of the table, pretending to read the ceiling. Evelyn didn't even pretend. She just looked down at her manicured hands and said nothing, because they knew. They knew the money that had propped up their lifestyle wasn't legacy. It was leverage, and I held every inch of it. The silence thickened, no one breathing too deeply, no one willing to make the next move. until Matthew stood, his chair scraped back with a sharp squeal. He looked down at Clarissa, voice low but trembling. "I just need to know one thing," he said. "Did you marry me because you loved me, or because of what you thought you could access through my mother?" Clarissa blinked. "Once?" He stepped closer. "Answer me, just one word." She looked at him for a long moment. Too long. Her face didn't change, but her silence did. It expanded. It exposed. She didn't deny it. She didn't confess either. She simply looked away, the shame curling her shoulders in. And in that instant, something inside my son fractured. No yelling, no tears, just a quiet break, the kind that changes a person forever. It didn't take a courtroom or a scandal and just one unanswered question. Clarissa signed. No words, no tears, not even a glance at Matthew. She just picked up the pen, scribbled her name, and set it down like she was signing for a package, not erasing herself from a life. Then she reached for her phone, dialed her attorney, and said with clinical precision, "Withdraw all filings. I'm accepting the out-of-court settlement." 48 hours later, the $10 million was transferred. By the end of the week, Clarissa was gone. Not a note, not a forwarding address, just a void where the storm used to be. Matthew didn't come around for days. When he finally did, it was late. I was folding laundry on the living room couch, mind half on the TV. He walked in without a word, sat down across from me, elbows on knees, and stared at the floor like it might offer answers he couldn't get from me. "Did you always know?" he asked. I folded the last towel before answering. "I did." He looked up, eyes glassy. "And you let her humiliate you like that? Let her treat you like you were beneath her? You didn't say a word." I gave a soft, tired smile. "Matthew, sometimes a mother has to lose face to keep her son from losing everything else. But there's one thing I wasn't willing to lose: truth." He nodded, but his face still twisted with a mix of guilt and disbelief. I stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a slim folder, thinner than the last one, but heavier in meaning. "Sit down," I said. "You need to see what love never let you look at clearly." Inside were documents he hadn't seen before. First, Clarissa's drafted asset protection plan, labeled confidential, written 4 months before the wedding, outlining ways to shield herself from financial liability in case of divorce. Second, a prenuptial agreement she never sent, one she planned to propose after the wedding, citing wedding stress as the reason it had been delayed. And third, perhaps the hardest, an intake report from a therapist Clarissa had visited 6 times, where she described chronic emotional volatility, a tendency to compulsively manipulate in relationships, and unresolved trauma from parental pressure to marry for status. She had concealed it all. When Matthew looked back at me, he didn't speak. He didn't have to. The grief in his eyes wasn't just for the marriage he'd lost. It was for the illusion he'd lived in. And finally, I saw it. Not the boy I'd protected, not the son I'd made excuses for, but the man I'd hoped he would become. He reached for my hand. "Thank you," he whispered. I squeezed it gently. "Better you lose her now than lose yourself slowly later." He stayed until after midnight. We didn't speak much, just sat in the stillness, side by side, mother and son, both quiet, both changed, both free. A year later, June rolled in with its soft breeze and bright sun, and I finally unpacked the last of my boxes in a small seaside apartment in Santa Barbara. The ocean lived just past my window now, close enough that the sound of waves had replaced clocks in my daily rhythm. Mornings were for walking the coastal trail. Saturdays, the farmer's market. No boardrooms, no subpoenas, no masks. In that quiet, I finally did something I'd put off for years. I established the Forsyth Fund, a scholarship foundation for engineering students from low-income families, designed to help them develop and patent their own inventions, just as Robert and I once dreamed of doing when we were two broke kids with one brilliant idea and a used printer. It didn't make headlines. That wasn't the point. I didn't want attention. I wanted momentum, something that would outlive me, something that wasn't wrapped in wealth or war. One late afternoon, Matthew came to visit. He arrived carrying a bag of fruit and a nervous kind of smile I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, bringing home a report card he wasn't sure I'd like. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was Anna, a warm-eyed woman with a quiet laugh, dressed simply in jeans and a linen shirt. No diamonds, no designer handbag, just calloused hands from long hours at a community clinic and a look in her eyes that told me she saw my son, really saw him. When we reached my apartment, she looked around at the cozy space, the books stacked sideways on open shelves, the hand-thrown pottery mugs, and said with a soft grin, "Matthew said you're the most down-to-earth person he's ever known. Now I see why." I smiled. It wasn't forced. Matthew glanced at her, then at me, voice quiet. "Mom. This time. I think I got it right." I didn't say anything at first. I just reached out and took his hand, gave it a squeeze he didn't try to pull away from. He didn't need lessons in money anymore. He needed room to grow without being measured by what he had or didn't have. And this woman beside him, she wasn't chasing legacy. She was building one of her own. We spent that evening talking over simple pasta and local tomatoes, the kind of meal no one would post online, but the kind that fills a room with real warmth. Anna laughed easily. Matthew listened more than he talked. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to defend the life I'd built. I just got to live in it. When they left, I walked them to the sidewalk, the sun dipping low behind the water. Anna hugged me, firm, genuine, no performance, no angle, just kindness. And Matthew turned back before getting in the car, eyes soft. "I love you, Mom. I really mean it this time." I nodded, holding it in. Because this, right here, this was the win I'd been playing for all along. Not a victory in court, not silence bought with money, but clarity, peace, and the freedom to let go. I didn't destroy Clarissa. I simply stopped feeding the fantasy she had latched onto like oxygen. Sometimes, the most elegant punishment is letting someone realize they were never standing on solid ground to begin with, and walking away before they ever see you smile